All right, so in the last podcast, we went all into the Mod case. And if you're not familiar, I'll put a link in the description for the podcast. But what it is a young couple, Heather and Charles Mod, have been indicted for stealing federal property. And the whole case is based on a fence that the Mods have never moved and has been there since 1950, before either of them were ever even born. And all of a sudden, they're now facing 10 years in prison each. They've both been indicted separately. They've had to retain separate lawyers. They've been told not to talk about the case. There's just all kinds of stuff that makes absolutely no sense in this whole case. And after I did the podcast, I got an email over the weekend from a Kyle Edoff, who grew up with Charles, and actually he was Charles's one classmate up through the elementary school, because they actually went to a country school, which I couldn't believe that they still did that, because they're both like 40 years old, younger than me, and I didn't know they still had those country schools, like Little House on the Prairie, if you're not familiar. But Kyle and Charles were classmates, and Kyle told me that he didn't think Charles had ever done anything wrong in his life, let alone steal government property and need to go to prison for it. But the other thing Kyle told me that kind of sent me on this wild goose chase is he told me I needed to look at a map and to really get a sense of what was going on in the neighborhood, kind of. And that made sense. I'd seen pictures kind of the property line, different things like that. And one of the people who have been talked about, Keely Cavello's done a ton of really good work on this with her website, America Unwon, and she has 2 articles kind of describing the case and what's going on. And when in her last article, she talked about a Dan O'Brien who was going around in the county and buying up a bunch of land for his buffalo ranch. And so there's kind of a land grab, and nobody really is sure what's going on, but they feel like it's probably connected to this Travis Lunders, who is the Forest Service agent who is prosecuting the Mods. And when I talked to Kyle, he talked about this Dan O'Brien, and that's why I need to look at a map to see what land he's taken over and how it connects to federal lands in the USDA. So I get on here, and this is Custer County, and so you can just search up, I search the Mods, and then I search Dan O'Brien, Daniel H. O'Brien, and you come up with, these are the parcels that he owns. You can click on them and then go map. It shows you the land that he owns, and down here is where the Mods own. And then I just start clicking around the neighborhood, and what I noticed down here was there's a lot of land owned by the Cheyenne River Buffalo Ranch. And so I look at who that is. A Cheyenne River Buffalo Ranch sounds real similar to what Dan O'Brien's doing. They have the same mailing address. And then I got to looking around. Dan O'Brien owns Cheyenne River. But then I got to looking next to the Cheyenne River Buffalo Ranch, and I find Bison Ranch LLC owns a ton of these little parcels here in the same neighborhood as Charles and Dan O'Brien. And so Bison Ranch LLC, who is that? So you can click on this parcel report, and it brings up an address. They're based out of Ventura, California. At first I thought, well, it's another Dan O'Brien kind of entity, but Ventura, California, that seemed weird to me. So I just cut and paste that address into Google, and Patagonia comes up, the clothing company. To be specific, that address is the Patagonia Great Pacific Child Development Center, which is where all the Patagonia employees, it's like the daycare for their employees. And so what is Patagonia doing buying up South Dakota farmland? So if you go back, you can see this is all of the property that Bison Ranch LLC owns, presumably Patagonia. And if you've listened to our podcast, Shad brings up a lot of times the wildlife corridors, which means these environmental crazies want to connect all the federal lands and make it so these in this case, I would assume buffalo and antelope can move freely between throughout the country. Really, farmers and ranchers don't need property. What we need is wildlife to be able to move freely throughout the country. And if you look further into Patagonia and their support for wildlife corridors, they have this was written in 2019 by a Senator Tom Udall out of New Mexico, and his hope for the wildlife corridors. This is Patagonia's website, and he talks about how these things need to exist. In 2008, they actually had a program called Freedom to Roam, introducing freedom to roam. And it was on the Patagonia front, we're excited to announce our new environmental initiative. If you click on any of these links, there's all kinds of stuff. There was maps, books, different websites. All of that is gone. They have, it just takes you to their main page where they want to sell you their stuff. But the main reason for that is the same reason they're buying land under a different name and not letting anyone know what they're doing, I'm assuming, is because there was a big push, and especially Keeley talks about a Scott Edoff, which is Kyle's dad, I believe, who went to Washington, D.C. and fought against this Buffalo Gap National Grasslands, which was pushed around this same time. I think it was 2011. So just a few years after this Patagonia initiative was released, there was a big pushback that caused people in that neighborhood to go to D.C. and fight back against these kinds of things happening. And so as soon as I looked at this, you think all of this land here on the east side of, this is the Cheyenne River, all of the land on the east side of the Cheyenne River is federal wilderness. It's federally owned. And that, if you keep going east, you'll end up in the Badlands National Park. But if you keep going west, right over here, this is like Hermosa and Fairburn, I think. And in this area here is is Custer State Park. And it's actually called the Wildlife Loop, which is a drive you can take when you visit Custer State Park. If you're familiar with wildlife corridors and you see that this property hooks up with the federal land and it starts aiming this way, you got to think that it looks like they're pushing in a direction, right? And so what does this have to do with the mod case? Well, as this property continues in this direction, guess who owns this parcel right here? Charles and Heather Maud. And now the property in question isn't even over here. This has nothing to do with the mod case. It actually is over in this area where my mouse is. Just to give a kind of a clearer picture of what's going on in the neighborhood here, I printed this out. What's in black here is Dan O'Brien's property. It is here and here. This is the Patagonia property. USDA, which is the Forest Service, federal-owned lands, is in gold here, these gold chunks. And this is Charles and Heather Maud's. This is Maud family land also, and Maud family land also. This is, I think, Charles's uncle. So if you're looking at, the corridor would go this direction, I would assume, if that is the plan. Does everyone who stands in the way of that at this point, they have the same last name of Maud. Up here is actually where where this fence line dispute is going on. And so it's kind of like almost, if you didn't want to draw attention to this and you want to put pressure on the Maud family, where would you do it? One thing I think that people in the neighborhood should know is that Patagonia, a global corporate company, is coming in and buying up ranch land. I think everyone in the country should know that. And why are they doing it under Bison Ranch LLC? It's because they don't want people to know that, right? Well, and why is Dan O'Brien acting like he is the one buying up the land? There's an area here that would connect Charles Maud with his parents' property. And there was another Maud that was going to come in and buy that, and at the last minute, Dan O'Brien came in, handed him a check, gave him a better offer, and ended up buying it. Everyone in the neighborhood thought that it was Dan O'Brien's land. It's actually Bison Ranch LLC. And to go back to the mod case, I I don't know if this has anything to do with the mod case. I don't know. Maybe Patagonia just wants to buy up South Dakota ranch land and run buffalo on it. I don't know. But I think it's really important I want to do this video because I think it's important for everybody to know what's going on, especially people in that neighborhood. You know, and when there are things like this that are happening in the neighborhood, where also a young family with 2 young children are now facing 10 years apiece in prison for doing nothing, having a fence that's been there, owning a piece of property that's been in their family since the early 1900s. It all just creates a lot of questions, that need to be answered by Travis Lunders, Dan O'Brien, Patagonia Corporation. And you know what? Maybe I talk a lot about Unlonesome Lands, about the destruction of rural America, and that's kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing. You know, and rural America is dying. Over the past 5 years, 140,000 farms and ranches have stopped existing. They no longer exist. 107,000 small beef cattle farms and ranches have went away in the past 5 years. And we talk about, you know, how these small towns are drying up. The schools have to merge or close. You know, they don't have enough kids for football teams, all of these kinds of things. And when you have this global corporation coming in and buying up thousands of acres and taking it all out of production, no more families ranching on those lands. All those little squares on that map were at one time different families that owned ranches and farms in that area. And they're gone now. They were all contributing to that community. And, you know, that little schoolhouse is gone now. And you know, these small communities, this is happening from everywhere, especially in the West and the Midwest. But I really feel like Lonesome Lands and what we're doing here is the main vision is to support rural America and to stop that from happening. And that's what I want to do with this. But also, we are still dealing with the Biden administration USDA. That has become obvious with this family. This needs to be pushed to the forefront of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which oversees the U.S. Forest Service. And this kind of stuff, especially this case, needs to be stopped. Donald Trump and the Trump administration needs to look at these kinds of things that are destroying this family. I cannot imagine being under investigation and facing prison time when you have 2 small children at home and a ranch to run. Please share the video. I'm not really sure how to get this out to more people or who to contact. I would assume call USDA, call the Forest Service, but mainly share the video and get people to understand what is still happening in the Western United States and in rural America, and how this stuff still needs to stop. Just because we have a new administration and new president who's not hell-bent on land grabs, it doesn't mean it's not still happening. And if you want to support what we're doing, go to lonesomelands.com, click subscribe. There's different ways there you can help out what we're doing. Stay tuned.